I was born and raised in a restaurant, and I remember I was peeling prawns actually on a milk crate when I was 8 years old down on Fisherman's Wharf. And I always fell in love with the wharf and with restaurants in general. And when I went away to school, that was for culinary school, that was in the late 70s, early 80s. So that was right before California became such a big wine state, right? Do you remember back in the 50s and the 60s, we didn't have Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs. We had what? We had Chateauneuf-du-Pape, and they were named by the regions. So when you looked at French wines and you talked about wines, it was about their location. And that's why the names have changed. Now, when I came back from school, that's right about the time that the California boom started. So what happened was, up in Napa, there were a couple of wineries that entered a blind wine tasting in France. And you know, the French at that time, they had the best wines, and there was nobody else that could have wines like they had, right? California entered a few and actually won the competition. And everybody was shocked that California did. So from that point forward, all of the orchards up there used to be peaches. There were a lot of grains that were grown up in Napa and Sonoma and Mendocino and all of those areas. Nuts, almonds, walnuts, all those things were grown up there. Suddenly they were taking all of those plants out and they were growing grapes. Now before that, UC Davis, is everybody familiar with UC Davis, right? They're very big with agriculture. They're the ones that decide about the seeds and how to grow things. They had what were called, and I'm mentioning this because one of our wines has some of these, they call them ancient vines. And when we say ancient, I was born when these vines were planted, so they can't be that ancient, right? But when we look at California wine industry, we're talking about from what, late 70s on. From late 70s, when I was high school, college, right? I'm sure all of you were probably still in grammar school back then, right? But the 70s and 80s, right? So that's when our wine industry started. But back in the 60s, as experiments, UC Davis went all around California and planted small acres of different grapes to see what grew where. Because we're going to talk a little bit today about how different wines taste. And some of them, well, white and red, that's easy, right? But we're going to say, oh, this one's buttery, or this one's has a grassy flavor to it. I'm going to keep that to a minimum, because to me, there's two things. A wine either tastes good or it doesn't taste good. And that's it. And I understand, you know, a lot of, and it's fun to have these classes, right? It's fun to sit and try to pick out some of those little things. But realistically, if you want to drink a red wine with whatever, it doesn't matter. You want to put ice in your wine, it doesn't matter. There's no expert that can tell you the only way to drink a wine. So I'm not here to do that. I just want to have a fun time explaining a little bit about wines and a little bit about how they pair up, what makes it a little easier sometimes to have things taste good when you eat them together, and why. But anyway, back to the ancient vines. They planted Zinfandel up near Lake Tahoe. They planted Pinot Noir down on the coast and all over the place. And through those experiments, they found out, oh, this soil works really well with this grape. The reason that this grape, it tastes so good here and not in the valley is because the grapes get cooled off in the afternoon because the fog rolls in. And that's very important at how the sugar grows. They get into a very, very, very scientific method on a lot of these things. And so that's what makes wine so different. Well, this Zinfandel does have a small percent of what they call the ancient. They have another one that's all ancient vines. I think this one's actually a little bit better. It's got a little more character. But those ancient vines are the vines that still are growing today that they planted back in the 50s and 60s before we had a wine industry. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? Okay. So a Chardonnay, where is a Chardonnay from? Is there a city called Chardonnay? Is there a valley called Chardonnay? No, actually Chardonnay is the grape. When California became very big with the wine industry, instead of saying Pouilly-Fuissé or naming it after areas in France, like France does, because Pouilly-Fuissé is predominantly one or two different white grapes. Instead of doing that, we said, no, we want to call it by the grape. So that's why all of these wines that we talk about here, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, Zinfandel, all of these, and then if you get into some of the other ones that you don't hear as much about, Barberas and some other ones, they're all the grapes. That's how California decided to classify these wines, is by the name of the grape. And then there's one other word called, it's called meritage. And I always think of getting married. I'm married 31 years now. That's how I remember the word, meritage, meritage. And meritage means that they take more than one kind of grape and they blend them together. So it's a blend, right? So if you had a Bordeaux from France, a Bordeaux is basically Cabernet Sauvignon. But they mix in. Cabernet, as you'll taste today, can be a little bit harsh, maybe a little bit heavy. So they blend a little Merlot, which is usually a little bit smoother to drink. And they'll blend a little Merlot in, and then sometimes they get crazy and blend 2 or 3 more little tiny percentages of other ones. But that's Bordeaux. Now there's other restrictions how they and why they call it Bordeaux. But that's pretty much it. A Bordeaux is like a Cabernet, but it's a meritage because they blend a few other ones in. So winemakers take different grapes and blend them. They do different things in the barrels. Some of these wines, and I'll go through them one by one. Some of these wines, when they fermented them, they didn't ferment them in barrels. They fermented them in stainless steel containers. Because I say, try this cheese with this wine, try it, but that doesn't mean you can't experiment today. That's all about what you like. But I did put together this little sheet of paper, and I have enough for everybody on the way out if you'd like to grab one. And what this does is it kind of gives you an idea or a guideline. It shows Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, and Zinfandel, which are kind of the top wines, right? The ones that you hear the most about. And on this row it says cheeses, herbs and spices, meat and poultry, sauces, and seafood. So if you follow the wine and you follow the for instance, if you say, I'm going to have pheasant for dinner tonight. Well, pheasant is listed here, meat and poultry. They say a Pinot Noir would be good with a pheasant. So it's kind of a guideline, just a fun little guideline for you to see what the general public thinks should go together, or what the experts think. But we're all experts as soon as we start drinking wine, right? Okay. Any questions, though, about that, about the grapes themselves? Basically, wine is just made by crushing grapes and adding yeast and letting it bubble up and letting all the bubbles from the yeast. The yeast eats the sugar, and it turns that sugar into alcohol, right? And then you let the bubbles go away, and you have wine. And if you put more yeast in and you don't let the bubbles go away, what do you have? Champagne or sparkling wine, right? It's that simple of a task. You're thinking back in the days. I'll tell you a secret, and this is a story that I don't tell a lot of people, but we had the restaurant in Fisherman's Wharf. We grew up, my family, I'm 4th generation. My grandfather was from North Beach. Growing up, my grandmother used to say, we'd say, hey, Nonna, before the restaurant, what did Grandpa do? How did he make a living before he bought the first crab stand? And she said, oh, he drove the grape truck, babe. And he drove the grape truck. What I found out later on was, yeah, he sold grapes, but all the wine that he made was underneath the grapes. They're in Prohibition, and that's one of the things that a lot of people did in those days. But how did he make it? He had no idea about steel tanks and malolactic fermentation, all these things. They crushed the grapes. There is yeast on the grapes, right? It made it into wine. They put it in bottles, and everybody enjoyed it. So one other thing to remember also is we have all different expensive wines and inexpensive wines. It doesn't mean that any one is better than the other. It really doesn't. And I know growing up, doing what I was doing, we had a lot of French and Europeans that would come to Napa Valley to meet or to go visit Ernest and Julio Gallo. Everybody remembers that, but we always thought of that as kind of being jug wine, and the wine connoisseurs thought of Ernest and Julio Gallo as being that cheap wine. But the Europeans, with all their fancy French wines and German wines and everything else, they thought that was the best table wine that you could buy. Because in France, realistically, we see the best. They only send over these really nice bottles. But what everybody drinks every day on the table isn't nearly as, it's horrible in a lot of places. it's not very good. So we are really fortunate to have very inexpensive bottles of wine that are of super high quality. And I have yet to find a super expensive bottle of wine that I thought was worth it, right? People pay $20,000 for a bottle of wine. I can think of a lot of things I'd rather do with $20,000. Give me, give me a $3 or $4 bottle of wine, and I can enjoy it with a steak any day. So anyway, with that, I'd like to start with the first wine, which is going to be the Hush Chardonnay. So the Hush is actually from Mendocino. Every Chardonnay, every area is going to be a different kind of Chardonnay, but there really are, depending on location. There are two different characteristics when you drink Chardonnays because of how it's made. Either it's going to be what they say big and buttery, or it's going to be very bright and could be very fruity and citrusy. Now this Chardonnay is very big and buttery. They put it in oak, and the oak actually has what's called vanillin, which is like, it's actually the same flavor somewhat as vanilla. So you put it into these French oak barrels and you get vanillin or vanilla in with the wine, and it leaves a really nice mouthfeel. So when they say a big wine, oh, that's a big wine, what they mean is it's like drinking pear juice. It's like drinking nectar, where you feel like your whole mouth still is coated with a really nice flavor, that it's big. And buttery, the same thing. It's just silky in your mouth. With this, we give me a chance to fill some of these.
Give us a few minutes.
Absolutely. With this one, we're going to try the Fontina, which is the small square round that's in the center of your plates, the Fontina. And why would we put those two together? Fontina is a very buttery, nutty type of cheese. Is everybody familiar with Fontina? Yeah, it's the white square one, right? It's very buttery and smooth, so it goes along with the wine.
You can taste it. There is ready. Okay.
So everybody has a little?
Have a note.
So if you get a chance, taste a little tiny sip of the wine first, and then eat the cheese and taste the wine again and see how the wine will taste different. Right, they go very well together. That's when we say we pair the wine together. They're a good pair. Right? If you had something that was big and strong and peppery, like if we did that same wine with the Zinfandel, this Zinfandel is actually kind of fruity, but some of the Zinfandels could be really peppery and strong and almost hot and very high in alcohol. If we did that, you wouldn't taste the cheese. Right? How many times have you eaten something maybe spicy and then you can't taste anything for a while because that spicy food makes it very, very difficult to taste the food because all you taste is the spice. But you see the difference when you try them. Now, if you'd like, again, try some of the other cheeses. I'd say the blue cheese we're going to save till last because that you'll taste for the rest of the tasting if you try it now, and it could make it a little difficult to try some of the other wines. But if you'd like, go by all means do. But you can see how with each bite it can change the flavor of the cheese. The wine can affect the flavor of the cheese, and the cheese can affect the flavor of the wine itself. This winery is also one of the earliest wineries in Mendocino. Because of the soil itself, because of the land itself, that actually translates a lot into the flavor of wines. Now, this family started back in the early 70s, and they were actually from the valley, and they grew peaches and almonds. Peaches and almonds or walnuts, one or the other. Nuts and peaches, there I'm safe, I know that for sure. And they decided to come up and grow some grapes. And then about 6 years in, took them 3 years before they bottled their first wine. 6 years later, a gentleman came along and bought the winery, and now his grandson is actually running the winery itself. So there's a lot of great stories behind a lot of the wines as well. So any questions about that wine? No? How many liked it? How many would say it's a good wine? Is it good? And what about the cheese? I love that cheese. The Fontina, it's one of my favorite.